Hello to all you here at the auditorium at the new school, and also hello to you watching this in the FemTechNet world, in the video archive later. I am Veronica Paredes, a lecturer here at the new school in the School of Media Studies, and I am also an instructor in the collective's pedagogical experiment called DOC 2014, which is called Collaborations in Feminism and Technology. Today, we'll be talking about, in this video session, we will focus on the topic of feminism, technology, and systems. And by systems, we're going to more particularly focus in on systems by way of discussing experimental digital narratives in the media arts. And I'm very pleased to introduce our two discussants once more for the video archive, Toni and Christiane Paul. The audience members here are already very familiar with them, and if you are watching this video, check the video description for a link to their website and their bios. So let's just get right into it. So to start, I want to begin with a pretty broad question about the topic. In your work as a media artist, writer, curator, critic, how do you define experimental digital narrative in experimental digital cinema, or narrative in experimental digital cinema? And maybe as a follow-up question, or put that in relation to systems and technology. And how do you connect this definition to the broader field of media arts?
Mm-hmm. Well, I'll start with the end of the question. I would say that experimental digital narrative or digital cinema are sub-genres and subcategories of new media arts. And the way you could define them in the broadest terms is that they make use of the digital medium in order to enhance narrative or cinema. So when narrative is, of course, much, much broader. When we're talking about narrative, it could be a hypertextual novel that you're navigating interactively, or it could be a game, or it could be cinema. All of those are ultimately digital narratives, or experimental digital narratives, you might say. And then there's the specific subgenre, I would say, of digital cinema and interactive digital cinema. And we have seen over time different approaches to it. So again, I would say it's crucial that the digital medium and its characteristics get used. So this type of cinema can be interactive, nonlinear, generative, customizable. Many of the characteristics of the digital medium get adopted here. And there have been different types of experimentation. Toni's work is one of them, and pretty much stands by itself also. If you compare it to, let's say, the works of Jeffrey Shaw and Michael Neymark in the 90s, which created kind of immersive, navigable spaces. Then there's database cinema, which really came about in the 1990s. People such as Lev Manovich, who has also written about it, doing a project such as soft cinema, which gets algorithmically constructed, and quite a few artists actually did that. So in this case, you create algorithms to put together more or less abstract narratives out of film clips or even individual frames. And what is important about this is that this type of experimentation is not only happening in a small field of new media arts, but has really infiltrated our thinking about films and movies. If you look at projects such as Christian Marclay's The Clock or earlier Video Quartet, that is not database cinema in the sense that it is algorithmically reconfigured on the fly, but it uses database aesthetics and the database logic in putting together a film. On YouTube, you have genres such as the supercut, this excessive re-editing of materials. So those are ways in which this form of experimental digital cinema has also entered the mainstream. There's a lot more to say, but in a nutshell.
Yeah, and I think that the digital medium profoundly changed the whole notion of representation, because I think prior to that, photography had been a form of memory and documentation that had a sense of truth or verity to it that has transformed within the mutability of digital culture. And that mutability, I think, is part of what really has fascinated me in terms of the way I've approached working with interactive media. So so first of all, there's the mutability, and then many, because it profoundly changed the nature of cinema, things that were prior to the digital considered marginal realms of culture, like puppetry or animation, get folded back into the center of cinema with digitization, with digital mediums, and then that reinvigorates their influence on the kind of history of film and the way, and of course games. And you have things. It starts to impact narrative and impact the way we think about constituting narrative. For instance, a film like Being John Malkovich, which is about a puppeteer who finds a tunnel into John Malkovich's head. That was actually about gaming culture, that, even though it never directly mentions it. A movie like Memento, which fragments time, that also, I think, comes out of it comes out of gaming engines and gaming culture, but also it's things in the air where there's a kind of people are starting to think about the idea of random access to things, of the way we start using the web, of the sort of horizontal and associative forming of information rather than something that's more sequential and linear. So I think that all of that stuff is the soup which kind of profoundly transforms cinematic narrative, even traditional cinematic narrative, and then starts to explode into this variety of forms that Christiane is talking about.
And to add to that, Mike Figge's Time Code,
exactly.
and a lot of Peter Greenaway's films, who from the beginning used drowning by numbers, this numerical kinds of systems, but then in the Tulsa Looper Suitcases really went into gaming as a component of the cinematic story. So I think all of that was, as you said, part of the cultural soup, and emerged out of that.
Yeah, it's part of the soup, and to me that it comes back again, not only to systems, but to instrumentality, like what becomes the instrument, and the apparatus is now the computer, and rather than, let's say, the film projector. And so that mutability, which I think to me is one of the most fascinating things about this medium, the mutability, images are no longer delivered at 24 frames a second, and they're no longer there's no longer a continuous system. There's suddenly the possibility of going from the still to moving images and back again, of creating time lapses, of creating this sense that time can kind of become rubbery and can be interfered with in real time, can be altered. And so the whole notion of improvisation becomes part of it as well. And that means that you when you're looking at something, you don't know that it won't change. And I think that's, whether something is different every time you see it or not, the fact that you know that it could be alters your experience of it. Mm-hmm. And so that becomes I think some of the ground that we're walking on to when we're working with all these new materials. I think also, these things are in the air, just in the same way that I doubt very much that the cubists had read Einstein's theory of relativity. But they're both like reacting to very similar kinds of things that are part of that historical moment. And I think that's happening in this this kind of reapproaching of narrative, which is, to me, quite fascinating. Because narrative is, of course, the way we represent ourselves to ourselves and the way we tell the story of our culture. Yeah,
and coming back to representational space, I think the new configurations of temporal and spatial relationships that the digital allows for. Yeah. Of course, we have seen experiments with that in the past, with montage and within the frame. But the digital medium literally allows you to explode the two or disconnect them. Yeah.
And it brings in that element of improvisation where nothing, it doesn't have to be fixed ahead. It can be happening. The experience is the making of it. It's happening in the moment. Which I think I think that is, aside from experiments in theater, I think that is probably something that hasn't happened that much in the past. Certainly not in terms of media and the apparatus that delivers what we think of as media.
Yeah, absolutely.
So mutability.
To get back to the myth of the total archive, right? That the idea that database can kind of present all aspects or all perspectives. To think through what the archive includes and what it doesn't include in the database, I want to talk a little bit about the other word in our kind of title, feminism, technology, and systems, as we're honing in on it. But to ask, how can feminist stories and histories connect to construction and deconstruction of experimental digital narratives as we're describing it, or thinking about how it gets kind of mutable or kind of exploded? How can feminist stories or histories that might be overlooked in the kind of general myth making that we have as a culture, how does database cinema, or whatever you want to call it, experimental digital cinema, allow for us to explore those stories and histories in more detail or at all?
Well, I wouldn't say that there is an inherent connection between experimental digital cinema and feminism or women in technology, because if you look at the practitioners, they're male and female. There certainly are pioneers like Toni and Lynn Hirschman, who played a major role in shaping this field. But I think the connection there isn't inherent. Where I would say there certainly is a certain focus on feminism is in the characters and stories themselves. Toni's work has created these very strong female characters at the fringes of society. And what I also find very interesting about that is historical connections. So the women in your films, they're encryption hackers. You might even say that Spectropia is a kind of media archaeologist.
She's a collector, yeah.
Collector going through trash and scanning it, and very active in that field. If you look at the history of women in computing, we have also largely forgotten about many of them. There was a recent segment on NPR about that too. Most people refer to Ada Lovelace as our token person who was so substantial in writing about Babbage, and also interestingly
being one of the kind of the originators of the concept of the computer.
Of the concept of computing, in that she actually pushed Babbage's machinery much further. But interestingly, there also was, in the early days of computing, it was people like Grace Hopper, who worked on the UNIVAC, and people like Jean Rafik, who helped with the ENIAC, with a team of 6 women. There were so many female programmers, and at the time, there seemed to be this basically category of male hardware people and female programmers in charge of software. And it's interesting that Grace Hopper actually appeared on the Letterman show, and Letterman said, "Oh, so you're the queen of software, right?" So that was in '86, and today we're looking at a very different landscape. I don't think that people per se think about programmers as being female, or software as a female domain. So there was a certain break-off point. But historically, where you are going with your stories is also very much to a time where women, interestingly, played a stronger role in that.
Well, even Hypatia, who was one of the early mathematicians. And I think with coding and programming, it became just like, I think there were early days of film where certain aspects of film were, there were a lot of female directors very early on in film, and then that disappears completely, and then it starts to kind of be readdressed a little bit in contemporary times. And I think that that's happening now with programming. For that, it became highly unusual to find female programmers for quite, probably since the mid-'80s, and probably before then as well.
Yeah, I think the breakup was before.
I think it was quite earlier. It's probably in the 30s or something. Yeah, even. Yeah, I think that a friend of mine called my characters librarian thrillers. They were. I think that I tend to find characters from an intersection of historical events. So I look at what is considered normal, and I consider it this big empty space. And then I start looking at the concentric circles of departure from the normal, and I find my characters in those concentric circles, and they intersect at with some moment, like in Artificial Changelings. My character in the 19th century is a kleptomaniac, and she lives at the time of the birth of the department store, which is also a big moment within the Industrial Revolution, and I was, and kleptomania was like to me a really interesting pathology, because there are certain aspects of it. I'm not claiming that it is not in fact a real pathology, or can't be, but it was at that point a kind of end run around the forces of merchandising, because the shopping mall had become, the department stores had become these, they called them cathedrals of commerce, and they were heavily invested in seduction and display. And women could only be out of the house by themselves when they were visiting with calling cards or shopping. The rest of the time they had to be chaperoned. And they started to have a tremendous problem with shoplifting. And if you were poor and you stole things, you just got thrown in jail, you were a thief. But if you were middle or upper class, and you started to produce a problem for them, because either the forces of merchandising were corrupting the pillars of society, or the pillars of society were corrupt, and neither was like a good solution. And so they pathologized the behavior and said the women were sick. Mm-hmm. And so that was interesting to me to study, and that became the center of that character. And her rebellion was almost an involuntary rebellion. It was a neurotic rebellion, whereas the character in the future, who's an encryption hacker, who has taken all the underwear and the corsetry and the architecture of that moment and kind of inverted it to become an exoskeleton that's like a protective armor. She's become a very, she's a kind of, she's a bit of an anarchist, and she's a hacker and an encryption hacker. So it was a kind of looking at these moments and looking at female role and inverting it and playing with it. So I almost always do that with my characters. That my characters come out, their armature is an historical moment, and how it. I try to get inside that moment and see what it felt like to be a person in that situation. So I'm trying to create a subjectivity for certain moments in history.
Yeah. So I think it's very important to provide this different take. I mean, the corset as exoskeleton, for example, is something that provides a more feminist reading of a trope that we see in popular culture so much. Transformers, coming from a very different,
totally.
and even, the Batmobile, there's this obsession with,
And those are all
those
exoskeletons too.
Yes,
it's
absolutely.
Like a different kind of
But you're almost rewriting the story, And I think another way of getting at that is media archaeology. Speaking about female programmers, or so many women who have made a contribution to the history of computing. And there is, I think, not coincidentally, quite a group of women who have dealt with media archaeology. Heidi Kumau in her cinema series, using optical instruments, Catherine Richards, virtual body. They're all going back to old image-making systems or Victorian salons,
Absolutely.
and investigating the role of the female body in relationship to that apparatus, or the body itself. It's not necessarily always focused on the female body.
Yeah, and I think it also is, in so many ways, at this moment in time, we're still almost in the zoetrope phase of whatever the next iterations of standardized media will become. In other words, in the very early days of film, like everybody had some crazy little machine that made pictures move, zoetropes and thanomastoscopes. And there were all these like crazy things that you'd spin and twirl, and they created. They were like these little idiosyncratic engines that made pictures move, and it slowly evolved into the film camera, and out of the film camera came not only the making of movies, but the funding, the financial infrastructures, the architectures, the theaters that were designed to make movies. In other words, the standardization provided then this whole outgrowth of things. And at this point, we're in this kind of in-between space, I think. I feel in a lot of ways that almost everything I do is a kludge in the sense of, I'm using, you're using cameras that were designed to do things to make a certain kind of thing, even working with a collaborative team, because I work very much as if I were making a film. But that group has often been trained to make a movie, and so it's like you've got like the reins on 16 people, and you keep trying to kind of shift it back to get it to make something that they're not used to making, So there's always that slight tension of the fact that you're trying to get off the path with a machete, and people, and there's a lot of things that want to pull you back on, and that is both, I think that makes it both a tremendously exciting period of time and one that can be, like daunting, frustrating, irritating, difficult to achieve things, difficult not to be constantly being retrofitted into, existing spaces, existing presentation systems.
So that gets me to the next question that I was wanting to pose about exchange and collaboration, and you're talking about collaborating with an art form, cinema, and kind of figuring out how that works in your work. But so I was also interested in the collaboration or exchange with the audience that you talk about a bit, and maybe more so explicitly with artificial changelings than maybe spectropia, which is more of a performance, but just exchange and collaboration in those unanticipated network publics that you might have, but also with the industry or with the art form itself. Just about exchange and collaboration and how that kind of works into the process.
Yeah, because there's collaboration on a whole lot of different levels going on, because there's the collaboration that happens when in the development of the piece. And my model is very close to a kind of a small scale filmmaking model, I think. And I tend to try and work over and over with the same people as often as I can, so that we develop a common language. And collaboration for me, because I'm sort of in the role always of being the director and the generator, usually the generator of the project. Once in a while I'll work on someone else's project, but mostly it's my project. I've written it and I'm directing it. The buck stops with me. and then my job is to find people I trust so that I can open up spaces in my work for them to do their work in. And the work has the greatest strength, I think, when the more I can trust the people and the more I can get out of their way, and the richer that chorus becomes, which is, I think, one of the things that makes it so significantly different from like an individual artist's work, is that you have this chorus of voices in it. Even though it may be my work, there's still there's, it moves in certain directions because, my technical director will have robotic skills and we'll start talking in airports, and all of a sudden, like the screens start to move, and those kinds of things happen because people have capabilities. And so I love that process. And that process, that kind of participation, I was saying earlier that the breakdown of boundaries between audience and performer, and that's also part of that kind of participation. It's another way in which you're inviting people into the work to have an experience. I'm not inviting people in to tell their own stories. I'm inviting people in to be immersed and to physically experience a certain kind of magic that might make them open to listening to the subtext of, and engaging with the subtext of a story.
At the same time, I would say it's very much their own story in that they're projecting so much into these systems or learning about themselves.
Yeah.
So I feel that experiencing a project like Artificial Changelings is also about discovering one's own mechanisms and projections and sense making. So it is on a very different level also the story of the audience and of the performer. Yeah.
I think that's an interesting. It's interesting the way in which that's breaking down, and then the ways in which over the last decade or two we've thought it would break down and it didn't, or ways in which this idea of interactivity, that it wasn't okay for it to be a single person, it had to be groups, this constant searching for, like larger audience interactivity, and how that has changed from, people holding up cards in an audience to things that are more like social networking around told stories that actually are still quite linear stories, although perhaps episodic, and I think so. I think the evolution of episodic structure within the context of digital media is really interesting because it harks back to Dickens in such a specific way, and yet there are ways in which it's different, almost in the way that a letter and an email are different, because I remember when emails first came out, and I thought, well, gee, it's like a not very satisfying letter, and then you think, well, you can't look at a single email. It's like a necklace. It's like a bead. It's a chain. It's a conversation that's happening in real time. And so that speed takes something and it turns it into a different entity. The speed of exchange transforms it, and it makes it into a new thing.
So to kind of wrap it up and get to the last question, what kinds of important questions are most pressing on your mind now in the field, as we kind of loosely define it, and what should people be looking out for in this audience and also in the video audience?
Well, what aspect are you going for in the larger new media field or interactive narrative and that smaller subgenre we're focusing on here?
I think the subgenre and the way that we even started talking about the ways that gaming was influential for early contributions to the field, and what that looks like now, or wearables in the way that you're using it, or even defining that horizon a little broader is fine too, I think. Obviously there's so many questions as there are so many contributions to the archive.
I would think that, of course, this is a growing area of experimentation, narrative, but the future will also be really influenced, I think, by augmented reality and mixed reality scenarios. We're seeing more games and also narratives created for mixed realities, meaning overlays of the digital or combinations of the digital and actually acting out in physical space, like theory has done movies where you essentially, you're navigating them over the phone and you're a character in them, and you have to make decisions as to, will I rob that bank and actually go into that building and do that? Of course, it's also a pre-configured narrative, but that's a whole new form of narrative space. And augmented reality, I think, will also play a major role in that. So a virtual overlay onto physical realities where you might discover, whole story-based scenarios. There's a lot of locative media storytelling going on at this point in time already. So I think all of these will be growing areas of experimentation. And even commercials, ventured into that. There was, I think it was the Infinity, or which I don't remember which car model it was, but there was an ad that was ultimately an interactive film where you could call in. That way they also get your number, of course, to navigate the story structure. And I think we need a lot of criticality to counterbalance, those developments.
Yeah, I think, even something like Google Glass, which I think of as hideously misplaced in terms of the way they're talking and thinking about how to use it, because I don't think I think doing your email as you're crossing the street is a really bad idea. But the idea that there can be interfaces, like lightweight interfaces that don't isolate you from other people, and that can, you could sit in a theater and see a cinema screen, and something could float off the cinema screen and everybody in the room could be looking at it. So that sense of shared public space in entertainment, I think, is really interesting and important. I'd say also one of the critical things coming up, certainly in this culture, is addressing the collapse of the nonprofit realm in terms of how the arts get funded. And because right now we're heading towards, the idea that everything is going to be like a kind of little commercial tchotchke, and then you see the complete absence of criticality, and then you have just a completely commercial realm. And I see it happening even in the language around development spaces and new media arts, where the people are, like they're incubators in museums, and not that it's ipso facto a bad idea, but it is, they are commercial models, and we do need to look at new funding strategies for the arts, or we're not going to have what we think of, what we have thought of, certainly in our lives as art. It's starting to change and become something different. Related to that, what is always very interesting to me is the relationship between this type of experimentation and the mainstream, mainstream culture, and also the mainstream art world, like resource.
Yeah, and how far does it get integrated or filtered through, or is diluted in culture itself, So I think, historically speaking, the more radical experimentation has always stayed on the fringes, while having an impact on culture in general,
and
but
sometimes
not
the
getting
slower
the focus.
Ones, sometimes it takes a while to infiltrate or become picked up and used in a different way. But it is one of the only forms of disinterested development, that isn't involved in a short-term profit motive. And that's like, it seems like to me, it looks like that's like a really important place for us to focus some of our energies.
And I also find it hard to predict. Obviously there is the paradigm of usually returning to an older technology to enter the mainstream. But it's hard to predict. In the 90s, for example, when the web came about and people were engaged in all kinds of experimentation, I had a vision for a very different future of people telling stories, for example. And then comes Web 2.0, and here we have YouTube, broadcast yourself. So we're using the technologies, but return to the broadcasting paradigm, basically, of one too many, only that one now can be everybody. So there are these interesting reconfigurations, for better or worse, that are taking place within that
you see it going in
landscape.
a certain direction, and then it ends up, like 5 years later, you look around and you say, huh, that's interesting, that sure didn't happen.
Yeah.
So thank you for coming in and having this conversation. We'll have a Q&A with our audience here, but I just wanted to address the video, which is a system and a network. We're broadcasting ourselves. And thank you for watching out there in Femtech Net land. So thank you. Thank you, everybody. And we'll start the Q&A. We could just do an applause at the front.
Thank you.
Okay, so there are microphones. There's one here. They're very short, or you can just yell from where you're sitting. I think that, there's not that many of us here. Does anybody have any
Questions out there?
I mean, we just predicted the future. This is always
and
many questions.
we're obviously going to be wrong.
Question for Toni Dove. I'm thinking or wondering how one gets to the point of being able to make the work that you're making. And I'm not speaking in terms of economics and funding or collaboration, but really just a matter of being able to integrate these technologies into your thinking. And how different it might be for a young person growing up today, because I don't imagine that you grew up with technology in the way that you're using it at all.
No, not, and certainly not the way in which, like the students right now at the new school have access to technology. I mean, the first computer I used I used to control multiple slide projectors to create movies, and it had like a 1 meg floppy disk hard drive. So yeah, no, and so I didn't study it either. So
But I would
picked
imagine
it
that
up.
even prior to that, as a student, say, as you were entering college, that, well, just speaking from my own experience, none of this technology existed remotely. I think when I entered college is when I first saw a computer screen in the mid-'70s. So how did you, could you describe the transformation of your
trajectory?
experience,
Yeah, I mean,
given your background?
I started out as a painter, and then it started to feel like a shirt that was about 3 sizes too small, largely I think because I was so interested in narrative, and it was a period in time where that was, where the visual arts world was somewhat hostile to narrative. And I started working with collages as sketches for paintings. And then the collages started to turn into like a slideshow that, that I developed a soundtrack for, and that was sort of, and then I started working with these 3-dimensional screens and multiple slide projectors and Laserdisc players, and kind of, it was almost like moving collages, moving 3-dimensional collages. And I was using these technologies that they were using for corporate shows at that point, and at that point you really couldn't do video processing on a computer yet, image processing. So I was working with slides, and occasionally I'd go someplace like Film Video Arts and edit, some video that would get put on a Laserdisc or something. And then as the technology evolved, and I started working with people because I would need certain things, like I need programming. So I started working with programmers, and I've worked with programmers over years now. I think students now have access to microprocessors, and they learn the Arduino like I learned how to use Paint. So they have a facility with it that's phenomenal. So for me, it was collaborative, and it's also, I think it has something to do with just the way my mind works too. I look at something and I say, it's supposed to do that, but what if you did this with it? It's just like the way my mind works. And then and then I started putting things together, and I think it's slow. It's a slow kind of evolutionary process. You do a little thing, and then you add another little thing, and then you add another little thing, and pretty soon you have like a much bigger thing, you know, and you start to figure out how this can talk to that, and you add this, and you're looking around all the time, and things are fascinating to you, and you meet somebody who knows how to do that, and then they come and work with you, and, and you add that. And so it's a kind of evolutionary process, I think. Does that answer your question?
It does, but how do you feel that your own personal history informs your current aesthetic in a way that perhaps might be different from somebody coming up now? Or do you feel that it has? In the sense of, as you described, starting with collage.
Yeah, it's kind of hard.
Is that still somehow embedded in your process, those early experiences?
Oh, of course, they must be. You know, I don't know how to answer that really, because I don't know what it's like to be 20 now. And I can't tell exactly how much, you know, exactly how my early history changed things. I would say that some of the things that I'm noticing, maybe I could say more about how I noticed some differences, that there's a sense of scale and depth and kind of sustained attention that is really changing a lot now, so that things are more horizontal and associative, and I find that interesting, but at the same time, that loss of wiring that can give you like a long, steady, focused groove seems like it might be problematic to me in the long run. It's like, you know, sometimes I think multitasking is the emperor's clothing of the 21st century, because you know, we've seen all these studies coming out now where it seems that, you know, every 10 years people are comfortable doing 3 or 4 more things simultaneously, and yet they don't retain more, and they don't comprehend more, and so, you know, so obviously we're in this process of navigating this new terrain, but I don't think we've landed in the most fruitful spot yet. I keep looking for the depth on the other side of topology.
Are there any other questions that someone might have? Mario.
I'm glad I'm not the only one doing that.
Maybe to add to this question, can you talk a little bit about your influences, you know, of other artists contemporary to you, and especially the downtown connection with experimental theater, like Foreman, Worcester Group, and how does
Yeah, like what are some of the things that influenced me?
that influenced me? Yes.
You know, it's interesting. I think that early on, like there was a whole period of time in the 70s where Brooklyn Academy of Music's Next Wave did a whole series of incredible experimental theatrical presentations. Laurie Anderson's United States 1 through 3, Saul LeWitt and Lucinda Childs and Philip Glass did Dance 2 and 3. There was Laura Dean's Dancers Spinning. These were these were things I think that had a really profound effect on me. Steve Reich and Philip Glass's music, which led me to, you know, studying gamelan music and thinking about different kinds of harmonic structures and different kinds of structures for sound. All that stuff had a huge influence on me. And at the same time, certain writers and people like, you know, and Hitchcock, you know, I think Hitchcock probably has as profound an influence on me as anyone. So it's sort of cobbled together. My interests are cobbled together from a very broad spectrum. And then I've kind of grown up working with a lot of people, like Elliot Sharp has done soundtracks with me over a number of years, and I've worked with Luc Dubois, who's a software designer who's worked with me. We've worked together for like 15 years.
And artist.
And yes, he's
In his own
yeah,
way.
he's a significant and well-known artist, as is Elliot, a well-known composer and multi-instrumentalist. But yeah, so I've worked with a number of downtown, different artists that have been kind of my collaborators, and therefore the soup that I live in, and I think we all mutually influence each other. Yeah, I mean, I've been influenced by everything from Rembrandt and Crazy Cat to all different kinds of music and performance work. I love the Worcester Group. Sometimes I think of the Worcester Group, like my software engines as kind of Worcester grouping video.
I think there's a way to also connect how your two trajectories intersect, or how you became interested in new media arts, or whatever we want to call it, if it's called digital art or experimental interactive art. And thinking about when you came to know Toni's work, and if that had anything to do with people that you get associated with, even if you didn't collaborate with them or necessarily were inspired by them at the time.
Yeah, I mean, my trajectory was a completely different one, also a very common one, but very, very different from Toni's. But definitely the new media world in the 90s was in New York was a relatively small scene. I mean, we were always globally connected to other people.
Yeah, because it was this kind of international conference bubble it was a fascinating moment in time.
Conference and festival bubble, and that's still going on. So you always feel very much in touch with what's happening really on the other side of the globe. But at the same time, there was kind of a New York scene, and within that, even a kind of cinematic one. Graham Weinbrand, doing. His projects, also using some of the similar strategies in mirroring, if I
absolutely.
think about Sonata and the Kreutzer Sonata. And so that's how we kind of intersected at that time. I felt it was more closely knit in the 90s than it is now, because there's a whole new generation of practitioners. So it's a new world, more distributed.
And the media world itself, the new media
changed,
world has
yeah.
balkanized in the sense
Yeah.
that there was that period, I don't know, I'm not sure exactly when that happened, but where it no longer became kind of new media as a scene itself, but it was more like there were elements of it in the art
Yes.
world, elements of it in theatrical performance, in musical performance, and then the Ars Electronica segment, which then became sort of the more techie segment. So it's interesting how it changed.
Yeah, that happened in the early 2000s, definitely.
Yeah, and then the discourse changed a little too, because it was it was so fantastically, wonderfully, intellectually interdisciplinary in the early days too, which is always part of the excitement of something that's forming.
Coming back to that question, because I think to some extent it's ironically harder for the next generation because the use of technology is already so prescribed, and most of the people I know of the earlier pioneers, well, there were no digital media programs. They came from painting, from architecture, from computer science, from all of these different fields, and basically created their language and field. Well, when you start working in that field today, there are certain areas in academia and practice already created for you. So sometimes I think that might make it harder, to be as inventive and subversive with the technologies.
It's interesting. I think you're right, because even though it's not complete, it isn't standardized yet, there are definitely like grooves, like there's the gaming groove, and that there used to be, instead of people forming rock bands, they were all forming these little new media groups that were making all these kind of crazy CDs and things that would do, and that were quite diverse, and that's narrowed down quite a bit. It's It's much more, like there's the gaming industry, it has certain genres, it has certain ways of working. Yeah, it's interesting.
Are there any other questions? Yeah, I come from a program that institutionalizes these things. I come from a media arts and practice program in a cinematic arts school. And even though these genres are starting to be defined, it's maybe figuring out how to borrow from some of these things, which is, what you were doing in that time with that soup. It's all about what soup you have, right?
Mm-hmm.
And if you're able to make it intelligible for your own voice and all these things, but it is, I think, as difficult to find a form that's true to your own kind of message or art.
Well,
Anyway.
that's always the,
Yeah,
that's always the
a
tough part.
challenge, yeah. So if there are no other questions, I think we can wrap it up and, let's give another round of applause, a third one afternoon to our guests. Thank you for joining us. And thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.